Okay, welcome to this first and very special Downtown Den conversation of 2022. I'm delighted to be joined by Lord Andrew Adonis. Andrew has been an advisor to Tony Blair, to Gordon Brown, even to Boris Johnson, and was actually considered to be the brain of the Blair government. He was also responsible for probably the biggest shake-up of education in England since the war, and he was the mastermind behind HS2. His recent book, It's the Leader Stupid, is one of the things we're going to be focusing on today. And I believe you're in London today, Andrew, is that right?
I am. I'm in my office in the House of Lords, Frank, which you can see behind me. The House of Lords unusually has been sitting on a Friday, and I was moving a bill this morning. It's called private members' bills. This is where individual people, apart from the government, can move bills to extend the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, which I think is a great new progressive cause. So I never stop. But nor do you.
Yeah, let's talk a little about that campaign. Very interesting, because am I right in thinking that as far as Scotland are concerned, 16 and 17-year-olds did get the vote in the referendum, didn't they?
They did, and in all Scottish elections as well.
Oh, okay.
And in Wales too. And the new German government, as I was pointing out to the House of Lords, part of its coalition agreement is that 16 and 17-year-olds will get the vote in federal elections in Germany. In most of the state elections, which is the because they have a federal system, there are 16 states across Germany, they have the vote already. So this is clearly an idea whose time has come. And in the last elections in Scotland, 75% of 16 and 17-year-olds voted, which was higher than the average of all voters, whereas, of course, traditionally, younger people haven't voted in such numbers. I think that's partly because they don't start voting until after they've got to 18, which often means not till they're 20 or 21. So it's not part of what they learn to do as they become young adults. And I think that's a very powerful reason for having the vote for 16 and 17-year-olds. I suggested in the House of Lords today, there should be polling stations in every school and college. Yes. So that when you go, part of becoming an adult at 16 and 17 is that you vote. And if the polling station is there when you turn up at college or school, it'll be easy to vote and a huge expectation that you will vote. And it means all the candidates will all be coming to the schools to make their case because, of course, there'll be large numbers of voters there and they'll take the young people seriously. So it'll be a two-way thing. The politicians will take the young people seriously. The young people will take the act of voting very seriously. And once they've got into the habit of it, then it will stick with them throughout life. So I think it's a win-win, really.
Yeah, it's an extension of the democratic franchise, of course. And I guess, Andrew, I know another subject very close to your heart is Brexit. And those of us who were campaigning to remain in the EU suggested, I think correctly, that had 16 and 17-year-olds had the vote, and let's face it, they are the people that are going to be most impacted by the ultimate decision we made. That result could have looked very different, couldn't it?
It could have done. All the evidence of polling was that 16 and 17-year-olds were very strongly in favour of staying in the EU. After it's their future that's at stake. And as one sixth former put it to me when I was doing a meeting, I don't want to be shut up on a small island with Boris Johnson. And you sort of get their point, don't you? And I think it's the young people who, by the way, will take us back into Europe in due course, because they don't want whoever is Prime Minister at the time. They want to have all the benefits of being in Europe at large, all 28 countries in the European Union, and not have their trade, their ability to travel, to study, to set up businesses, to form relationships, all so limited as they're going to be by Brexit.
Mm. We will keep an eye on that as the campaign develops. Just final point on this. Do you have cross-party support?
Well, the interesting thing is there was cross-party support in Scotland for votes for 16 and 17-year-olds. Indeed, one of the champions of it was Ruth Davidson, who was the Scottish Conservative leader. In England at the moment, as I found in Parliament earlier today, the Conservatives are against. Now, I think that's a straight political calculation that they think 16 and 17-year-olds would be liable to vote disproportionately anti-conservative. Well, I think that's a very short-term perspective, and I don't think you should judge the rules of the game by who may in the immediate future gain or lose. But it's not a clear-cut thing anyway, because in Scotland, where of course the Conservatives were a strong unionist party, 16 and 17-year-olds who had the vote in the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, they voted largely to stay in the union. They were very mature and sensible about this. Again, I think because they saw their future at stake and they weren't prepared to make gestures towards a Scottish nationalism that was going to imperil their ability to live, move, trade freely with England. So I think it was a short-sighted view of them voting against. But given the international trends, particularly what's now happening in Germany, I think the giving of the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds is unstoppable. It's just a question of dates. And if it doesn't happen now, it'll happen in a few years' time, and everyone will wonder what the argument was about.
Yeah, well, that's the same.
Votes for women, and remember, it was in our lifetime that the voting age was reduced from 21 to 18. So it'll be one of those democratic frontiers, which once it's taken, no one will want to go back.
Yeah, everyone will wonder what all the fuss was about. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, listen, one of the key reasons I wanted to have a chat to you today is that over the Christmas holiday, I had the opportunity of reading your latest book, which is It's the Leader Stupid. Fascinating book, focusing on a variety of leaders from different times in our history, and also from abroad as well. And of course, one of the characters that features is Boris Johnson, who has been in the news for all the wrong reasons over the past couple of months, but I think interestingly has demonstrated a number of the characteristics that you probably identify in your book. You've worked with Boris Johnson, you've seen him up close and personal in terms of his parliamentary performances. What do you think he believes will be the end game to this Partygate controversies that he's got himself embroiled in?
Well, Boris will certainly think that he'll survive it, because he always does survive it, and he survives by a combination of his celebrity and enormous ability to woo the media, if not, there's obviously a hostile media, but there's a very, very passionate pro-conservative media, which is absolutely wooed by him. Plus the fact that he doesn't play by the normal rules that other politicians play by. I think most of the prime ministers I've known wouldn't have held these parties and would probably have resigned as soon as it became public. But Boris doesn't operate by those rules. The study of him I've done in this book is called The Primitonian. He has an enormous sense of entitlement. He has a kind of extraordinary amorality. He is what matters is his own personal survival, and an extraordinary plausibility as well, and also a remarkable resilience. If you saw him in the House of Commons this Wednesday taking on Keir Starmer, you would think he was on the top of his game, and he was sort of hitting the ball for six, changing the subject all the time, all this Partygate thing. It's such minor stuff about what did and didn't happen in the cabinet room. I'll tell you what was happening in the cabinet room. He said we were just talking about the Ukraine, the end of COVID-19, the recovery, and the problem with the right honourable gentleman, he said, pointing at Keir Starmer, is that he's a lawyer, not a leader. Yeah. So turning on Keir Starmer, his very strength, which is he did do the forensic questioning, but Boris was good at dodging it. He's got that Oxford Union debating style from his Oxford and Eton background. And so I'm sure he will think that the end game of this is that he survives. Because he has survived controversy after controversy like this in the past, going right back to his 20s, when he had there was a really serious controversy about him and a mate from Eton making threats to beat up somebody who was being critical of them, and normal people who hadn't got their background probably would have been sacked in that situation. But he survived, and I think in a similar way, he thinks he'll survive Partygate.
Mm. I'll ask you whether you think he'll survive or not a little later, but you worked with him when he was London Mayor, and I think the general view was that was a successful tenure. He represented the capital well. He made the brand, which was already strong, internationally, I think, if anything, stronger. He obviously had inherited the Olympic Games, which was a fabulous boost. And he was very pro-European, if I remember correctly, during that period. What was he like to work with?
Well, he was fine to work with then. And you're right, he was a brilliant salesman. But the thing to understand about his mayoralty, though, is that what he was selling had already been decided by other people. So the Olympic Games, Tony Blair got the Olympic Games. He won in a famous standoff with Chirac of France. And in the International Olympic Committee, one of the last acts of Tony Blair as Prime Minister voted by a majority of one to give London the Olympics. So Boris, with his tripwire and all that, was selling a product, and he sold it very well, but a product which had been made elsewhere. And similarly, the big things he did as mayor to change the capital, like Crossrail, the big new east-west rail line in London that's opening next year, that had been done by Ken Livingstone and by the Labour government before. So again, his job was to sell it. And in particular, once the government changed to a Conservative government halfway through, to see that George Osborne and David Cameron didn't axe the funding, which they might have done if it had been a Labour mayor. So I think his genius when he was mayor is that he was a brilliant salesman of products, good products, which had been made elsewhere. The problem now is that he's selling his own products, and they're not very good, are they? Brexit, a slightly botched handling of COVID, and now Partygate. I can assure you, Partygate would not have happened under Tony Blair or Gordon Brown, particularly the very dour Gordon Brown. As someone said, if Gordon had heard there was a Partygate going downstairs, he would have come down from the flat and sacked everyone on the spot.
Yeah, absolutely. And just sticking with the London mayoralty for a time, it's a great point. And this sales ability that Boris Johnson has, because, you know, if you look at the London electorate, it's unusual for a Conservative to win. And I think he won 2 terms, Andrew, didn't he?
He did. And he won fairly easily as well, in what everyone had thought was a Labour city before. So it was a remarkable triumph, a bit like his 2019 election triumph, actually. In a very tight corner, he managed to pull off a coup based on a combination of celebrity, plus quite a good understanding of where the political middle ground is, particularly, of course, in 2019, when his opponent was Jeremy Corbyn, who left the whole middle ground largely vacant because he moved so far to the left.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've heard the comments from Rees-Mogg earlier this week when he suggested that it was impossible to remove the leader, the Prime Minister, from the Conservatives' perspective, because we now live in a presidential age, and therefore a general election would be necessary. Now, you and I both know that wouldn't be the case, but I thought it was an interesting point, and I'll tell you why. I see some comparisons between the Republican Party in the United States and the Conservative Party in the UK. I was with a Conservative MP this morning. I won't embarrass her by saying who, but I actually said to her, when are you going to get a Tory leader? Because it seems to me that Boris Johnson is almost a personal brand. He's a populist. He doesn't particularly seem to me to have any massive beliefs, principles. He'll shift according to what suits him at that short-term period in time. But do you see some of those comparisons, as I say, between what's happened with Trump in the States? The Republicans have now almost entirely been hijacked by that big personality. And we have a Conservative Party, I think, reluctant to, let's face it, they're usually fairly ruthless at getting rid of leaders, but they look at Boris and they think there's no alternative. This guy is still a winner.
Yeah, well, I agree with all of that. They, the moment they think that he's heading for the rocks electorally, they will get rid of him because, as you say, he's not a Conservative through and through in terms of his principles, values. I mean, he's not a Thatcherite or the kind of Conservative who a lot of Conservative activists and MPs want. But even at the moment, in the middle of Partygate, though there is a Labour lead, it's not a very big one. You know, you and I are old enough to remember the 1997 election. Indeed, I went to work for Tony Blair a year afterwards. On the eve of the 1997 election, the Labour Party was polling 52% and the Conservatives 26%. They were literally, it was 2 to 1. ahead. Well, now it's Labour's a few points ahead at the moment, and that's after a few weeks of Partygate. So I don't think at the moment that the Conservatives have come to the conclusion that Boris Johnson is a loser. They may come to that conclusion, particularly if the Partygate thing just runs out of control with the police, but it hasn't happened yet. And that's why they're prepared to go along with the populism, because the populism appears to be popular. Once the populism stops being popular, then I think he's for the knacker's yard very quickly. But for as long as the populism is popular and actually wins a Brexit referendum, wins a general election, gets them a majority of 80 in the House of Commons, with a lot of those MPs only there because they think they were on Boris's coattails, then I think he'll stay. It's not completely true to say, though, that Boris isn't a Conservative. He comes from Eton and a very wealthy and privileged background. He does naturally identify with the very successful, the oligarchs and all of that in society. It's true that he's prepared to play fast and loose with almost any policy in order to win, but his natural instincts are pretty nationalist, pretty right-wing, and pretty much in favour of the rich. And that, I think, is part of the reason why he went into the Conservative Party when he was young rather than the Labour Party. It'd be very hard to see somebody with his very privileged Etonian background and Bertie Wooster-type persona becoming Labour, wouldn't it? As soon as you think about Boris Johnson as a Labour politician, you see why, in fact, there's quite a lot of the Tory about him socially, even though when it comes to actual policies, he's prepared to be as populist as it takes to win an election.
And I think, Andrew, if you look at this from the business community's perspective, as obviously I do, from downtown and business, our members would say big taxes coming down the line, having gone through 2 years of really tough challenges with COVID. The famous comment during the Brexit campaign of F business, which Boris Johnson made, the leader and the Prime Minister of a party that ordinarily would be very closely associated with entrepreneurs and business, is not necessarily seen that way. And that's why I said earlier, as I say to my Tory friend, when are you going to get a Tory leader? Because from a business perspective, it doesn't seem particularly conservative in its approach as a government.
Well, certainly not with Brexit, because the business community was overwhelmingly against Brexit, and they're paying a big price in terms of, half of all companies that were trading with the European Union before Brexit are either not trading or have significantly reduced their trade. You've seen the queues of trucks still going through the Channel ports and so on. So when Boris Johnson said "fuck Brexit, fuck business," when he was doing Brexit, he sort of meant that. Not that he's inherently anti-business, but because the populist Brexit policy was what he got him over the line in becoming Conservative leader, business took the hindmost on it. So I think that's true. But the problem also for the Conservatives is that any likely successor to Boris Johnson, so Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, isn't going to move the dial on Brexit quickly. I think in due course they'll be more pragmatic, but it's not going to happen quickly. And therefore there isn't suddenly going to be a wildly pro-business Conservative leader, because the poison which we've had through this whole Brexit process, I think, is going to take some time to get out of the body politic. And I think that also works in Boris's favour as well, because if the policy isn't going to change that much if Boris goes, why have all the upheaval, particularly if you're not sure whether a successor will be as electorally successful?
The other big thing that, of course, aside from get Brexit done as a campaign slogan, was levelling up. And levelling up, I think, was seen, generally speaking, as delivering some big infrastructure projects, including the one I mentioned in my introductory remarks, HS2. Now, I was in Leeds the day after the announcement that that city is not now going to benefit from that fantastic investment that they expected to come their way. Any chance that that might be amended, revived, or do you fear that actually some of the additional monies that the government are clearly going to have to find as we go through economic turmoil over the next couple of years is going to see that project under further attack?
I think HS2 is definitely going to happen from London to Manchester. There are 250 building sites at the moment between London and Birmingham. It's actually being built. Indeed, I was talking to the the chief executive of HS2 yesterday. He tells me they're ahead of schedule. They've got two huge, great tunnel boring machines doing the two tunnels, and that's ahead of schedule. So it's definitely going to be built in the next few years from London to Birmingham. The legislation to get from Birmingham to Crewe has already gone through Parliament, and this week the government published the legislation to go from Crewe to Manchester. So it will definitely go London, Birmingham, Manchester. I'm very confident of that. And because it's going to go London, Birmingham, Manchester, I believe it will also go to Leeds in due course. Because can you imagine what the reaction in Yorkshire is going to be? A very proud county with huge industries and centres of population. Leeds certainly doesn't see itself playing second fiddle to Manchester or Liverpool or Birmingham, does it? When it slowly dawns on people, because as it will, when the line from London to Birmingham opens in 5 years' time, that the journey time from London to Manchester is going to be 1 hour on HS2, but it's going to be 2 hours to Leeds on a train with far less capacity and far less ability because of the new lines to create new services going in and out of the city. I think it will be unstoppable to build the line to Leeds 2. It may be later than currently planned because there's been a delay because of this immediate cancellation, but it's bound to be reinstated. The tragedy for Leeds and the eastern side of the country is that it could now be 10, 15, 20 years after the high-speed line is built up the west of the country from London to Birmingham to Manchester. That will give Birmingham, Manchester, and actually also Liverpool, because the high-speed trains will go on to Liverpool, even though there isn't a high-speed line going all the way. The trains will go all the way up to Crewe and then on to Liverpool. So it'll still be a very good and fast service to Liverpool too. That will give the whole of that northwestern part of the country and the West Midlands a huge first mover advantage, which means a lot of businesses, a lot of social activity, probably expanding universities will all be in those cities. And Sheffield, Leeds, Newcastle will be playing catch up. And that's very bad news for those cities that need the growth every bit as much as Birmingham, Manchester and Liverpool.
And doesn't sound like levelling up, really, does it?
Well, it's half levelling up, isn't it? It's levelling up one half. But the real tragedy of this is that there's a danger that we're going to get an east-west divide in the country across the Pennines on top of the north-south divide. And the whole purpose of HS2 was to bridge the north-south divide whilst being equally fair in terms of new rail services and infrastructure between the northwest and the northeast.
Well, again, one that we will keep an eye on, I'm sure. And you're absolutely correct, Andrew. The Yorkies were spitting feathers at the news that they've been cut out of that project at this point. But as you say, it's a movable feast, quite literally. And I'm sure we'll come back to that debate. Listen, I'm going to wrap up because you've been very kind to be so generous with your time for us this afternoon. But one final thing I wanted to ask you, and it's going back to the book, as I say, It's the Leader Stupid, fabulous read. Of the leaders that you clearly researched and then leaders that you've worked alongside, what would you say are the key qualities of a good president, a good prime minister?
Well, it's a combination of charisma and persuasion, the ability to really appeal to the public and cut through, which leaders like Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, I'm afraid Boris Johnson have got too. But to be a good leader, you've also got to have a good agenda. And the leaders I most admire in the book are Tony Blair and Roy Jenkins, who combined having real charisma and cut through with the public with a great social democratic agenda to change the country for the better. Education, 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 tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, a real agenda for improving the country. I'm very proud of that Labour government. Trebled health spending, doubled education spending in real terms, whilst significantly growing the economy. It made the country richer and fairer, which is, I think, the ultimate test of a good leader is, do they leave the country in a better state than they found it? And it's definitely true of Tony Blair that he did. I think it's also fair to say it's true of Margaret Thatcher, even though I didn't agree with a lot of what she did. But Britain was certainly in a better shape in 1990 than it had been in 1979. And I think that's the ultimate test of a good leader. And at the moment, it doesn't look to me as if Boris Johnson's going to be passing that test.
Yeah, well, for our sort of viewers who are not of our political bent, perhaps, I'll not comment any further on a personal level on that, but give us a timescale. What do you think the Conservative Party will do between now and May? Will they stick or will they twist?
Well, it's very hard to predict, but I think he'll squeak through as he always does, partly because his sense of moral shame is so non-existent. Anything short of the men in blue turning up with the actual charges and possibly the handcuffs, and he'll shrug it off. So only that, or a really serious slump for the Conservatives in the polls. I mean, a big slump, leading to a Labour lead of 20 points, something like that, which really shocks Conservative MPs, I think is going to lead to him going. And the odds are that neither of those two things will happen. But it's very hard to predict the future. And he's clearly, as ever with Boris, sailing very, very close to the wind. And you couldn't rule out, given the number of parties that were involved and all that he would get into really serious legal problems. And if the police were to move against him seriously, I don't think he could survive that. So I would put it just above 50% that he survives, but not much above. But then, that's always been true of Boris Johnson.
On that note, Andrew, thanks very much for joining us in the Downtown Den.
If you enjoyed that video, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel on the link below, and be among the first to get to listen to all the latest interviews through the Downtown Den.